All right. Okay, so shall we start now?
Yes, let's.
Great. Right. So today I'm introducing Dr. Andrew Campana's new book, Expanding Verse, Japanese Poetry at the Edge of Media. This book was published by the University of California Press in 2024. The book examines the role of experimental poetic practice at key moments of media transition and social change in Japan, spanning from the 1920s to the present. Andrew, thank you very much for being here today. I would like you to first briefly introduce yourself, including your institutional affiliation and areas of expertise.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Yoshiko. I'm really excited for this conversation. So my name is Andrew Campana. I'm an assistant professor of modern and contemporary Japanese literature and media at Cornell University in the Department of Asian Studies. And my research focuses on Japanese literature, especially poetry, on media studies, especially digital media, and on disability studies, and deaf studies as well.
Great, great, right. Okay, so next, just briefly, could you tell us what inspired you to write this book?
Yes, absolutely. So, in many ways, the core of this book was inspired by my encounters with sign language poetry. Initially, in the American context, my best friend is deaf, and I saw a movie about ASL poetry and went to a sign language poetry slam. And I was a graduate student in Japanese literature, and I was interested in to see if this phenomenon existed in the Japanese context, and of course it does. So I fell down the rabbit hole of Japanese Sign Language poetry videos and other kinds of Japanese Sign Language performances. And then I had the realization that this is just as legitimate of a literature, of course, as the Japanese literary canon I was learning about Soseki, about Hagiwara Sakutaro and other famous poets. But this was a whole other language and a whole other kind of literature that I didn't see represented in the scholarship at all in either English or Japanese or any other language. But I thought it was really fascinating because not only was it in Japanese Sign Language, but it really changes our assumptions about literature's relation to media and to the body, to who is allowed to be a poet, who's allowed to have their works counted in the canon of Japanese literature. And so, thinking really hard about these questions, I thought I really wanted my dissertation and now my book to have a very expansive approach to Japanese literary practice or literary practice in Japan, in which something like a Japanese Sign Language poem could be just as much part of the story as more conventional types of Japanese literature.
I really like your expression of going down the rabbit hole because many researchers can relate to that experience, right? Just
Absolutely.
starting with small and then expanding, right? And then from your book, I also understand that there is the moment of rekindling your love with poetry through your participation in a Boston Poetry Society.
Yes, absolutely. So this was in the middle of me preparing for my big general exams as a PhD student, where, you're really tested on your knowledge of the corpus of your given field, in my case, Japanese literature. It was so abstracted and it was kind of a lonely time. Like you just read hundreds and hundreds of books. So what do you do? But I was lucky enough to be living in Somerville, which is right next to Boston, and in Cambridge, Massachusetts, also there's been a long-running weekly poetry slam and open mic night called at the Cantab Lounge. So every Wednesday evening, poets from all walks of life gathered to share their work or to even compete while reading their poetry. And so at first I came just to witness this, an enormous range of people there, of all ages and races and genders, some professors, some paramedics, some baristas, some students, all types of people from all sorts of situations and performing poetry. Some were really funny poems, some were really cerebral, some were about their own lives, their own struggles, about disability, about work, about family history and family issues, which I found really important and inspiring and fascinating. So I started to perform my poems too, but my poems were kind of about the Japanese literary canon that I was studying, this kind of self-reflexive thing, sort of telling the story of Japanese poetry through my own poetry and poetic storytelling, which the crowd for some reason really liked. And I started to perform all across New England and eventually Japan. It really underlined to me the fact that one, poetry is a living practice. It's not something that only exists in books. Performance poetry and oral poetry and other forms of types of poetry across media are just as important. And the other is that we have this idea of a poet as, someone in the ivory tower or a very serious person who wins a lot of awards and thinks very seriously about things. And that does exist. But just as important is that poetry is a very accessible art form. The fact that it's short, the fact that it's shareable means that a lot of people can and do write poetry, even the ones that maybe aren't accepted as elite poets. Poetic practice is still such an expansive and welcoming thing. And so that further confirmed to me the fact that in my research, I wanted to have a formation of Japanese literature that included people like I saw every day at the Boston Poetry Slam as well.
I see. Well, what you just shared with us is really meaningful, especially for young scholars. So you can say, follow your passion, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Often, it's great to read books, it's great to talk to other scholars, but sometimes if you follow your gut feeling, like this is important and I'm invested in this, that's where the real magic happens.
Okay, now what unique arguments does your book offer? I'm particularly curious about one or two key arguments that set your book apart from other works of a similar nature.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think there's a couple of things that makes this book pretty different from other books in the field, or in other fields even. One is that part of the impetus, like I said, of this book was that I saw a big division between the worlds of literature and media studies. Japanese media studies has gotten really big in the last 20 years in particular, with tons of great works on Japanese film, anime, manga, video games, including your own wonderful work on manga, of course. And on the other hand, there's been a lot of really interesting work on Japanese literature, especially novels and fiction. But I wondered, why is it often seem like there's not things looking at both about the medial aspects of literature or the literary aspects of media? And I
Mhm.
found in this book, poetry is a particularly powerful lens in which you can look at both because poetry has a capacity to exist across media in a very fluid and easy way, maybe one that's more difficult than long form fiction because it's not about plot, it's not about characters, it's about sensation, it's about the moment or capturing a feeling, and that can be done in a lot of different media. So I think that's one thing that sets this book apart in that it doesn't look at literature plus media. It really looks at them as inextricable from one another. The other key argument that I think makes this book stand apart is the focus on non-normative embodiment and sensation, by which I mean the types of people who are allowed to be considered poets. There's this conventional idea of people in society, not just poets, but all people in an ableist society, that everyone thinks a certain way, sees a certain way, hears a certain way, moves a certain way. But what you find again and again is that often disabled writers and activists really invest in poetry, in not just writing works about their own experiences, but about thinking through disability and reshaping what poetry means or what media means. That's something I noticed again and again. Disability studies really influenced this book from the beginning. And it's not in the title. It could have been in the title because it's in every chapter, but I thought it might make even more of a statement to, even if I don't draw attention to it in the title, to have disabled perspectives and disability activists in almost every single chapter to some extent or another, and to have that inform everything as the kind of base sort of assumption and to make my intervention that way to scholars who maybe don't think they're interested in disability present a lot of different case studies about, hey, if you add this to your interests, you're going to have a much more holistic view of the
Mhm.
types of work that's out there.
And as you said, that poetry can be a very powerful lens to look into current states or the historical states of disability as well. Speaking of disability, in the context of disability studies, what key issue or issues were you hoping to address through this book?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So one thing I really hope to address in this book, and one sort of analytic that I really valued, was this idea of disability poetics. There's been scholars like Jim Ferris and Christina Scheuer who's talked about this, but basically that means what happens when self-identified disabled authors and poets, how do they imagine their relationship to writing or to media creation, like the shape or the formal aspects of a work, and how that could be thought of otherwise, in the same way that disability makes us reject the conventions of everybody is supposed to be like this. You find a lot of disabled poets and media practitioners rejecting the idea that poems are supposed to look like this or films are supposed to look like this. There's been a lot of interesting work on literary and cultural disability studies out there, of course, in both the Japanese context and elsewhere. But often there's a big focus on questions of representation, on disabled characters, and if it's a good representation or a bad representation, a harmful one or a nuanced one. And that is extremely important, especially when talking about narrative. But when we're talking about poetry, which is usually a non-narrative form in this case, some other questions emerge. And so, how do disabled poets use their disability poetics to think about the representations of a body or a sensation or cognition in unusual ways? So that's something that I was hoping to address in this book. Another thing is the idea of focusing on the theory or the philosophy of disability and disabled activists, but through other means other than just essays or books or speeches or policies or manifestos. All of those, of course, are extremely important too. And so many historians and theorists of disability use that material. But what I find is that when we look at poetry too, as a form, not just a form of literature, but a form of thinking about disability, as a form of thought in its own right, we often find different takeaways, different experiences, different types of people expressing their thoughts about disability using the form of poetry. Often the works are shorter, they're smaller, they're stranger, they're more focused on minor affects or irritations or frustrations that maybe aren't big enough deals to have whole books written about it, but a five-line poem, definitely, you could find something there. So poetry as a realm of thought is, and a thought about disability is something that really was important to me in this book.
So you mentioned that almost every single chapter actually touches the issue of disability. But in your opinion, how does your book contribute to the field of Japanese disability studies?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a really exciting time to be a part of the field of Japanese disability studies. There's the Monash Symposium, something like this, 20 years ago probably couldn't have happened. But now there's a real critical mass of scholars and practitioners across the world in Japan and elsewhere who are interested in Japan and disability in all sorts of combinations, which I think is wonderful. What I think this book contributes to these conversations, building off of what I said about the unique interventions poetry can make and so on, to take literary sources seriously in ways, again, as thinking, as the basis of activism, as thought. Eventually, I'll talk a bit about my third chapter about Yokota Hiroshi, but in general, what I find is there's a lot of self-identified disabled poets who have a lot of really interesting insights that might just be in their literary work, but might not be in the essay form. And also, there's a lot of canonical poets, people like Sagawa Chika in my first chapter, a modernist poet who's gotten a lot of interest these days, but who maybe didn't self-identify as disabled, but certainly had low vision and a variety of chronic conditions. And taking her work seriously as thinking about how she lived in her body and how she existed in that world in a way informed by disability poetics, I think is an important intervention. Often, an author's status as disabled in the Japanese literary context is seen as kind of an interesting fact about them, or maybe just part of a historical footnote. but to take not just their writing, but their own bodies seriously and how they must have shaped how they lived, I think is a really important thing to do, both in Japanese disability studies and other subfields within Japanese studies more generally.
Thank you. So, chapter three explores the work of Yokota Hiroshi, prominent Japanese disability activist and poet. So, this chapter three, titled You Forbid Me to Work, highlights how he confronted societal barriers imposed on disabled individuals through his poetry. So now the poetry includes his reflection, which I would like to quote from your book, page 88. He said, "What is poetry? I don't have a distinctive answer yet, but for me, at least, it has become the light for me to live by." And it has actually, the quote is a lot much longer. What key lessons do you hope readers will take from Yokota Hiroshi's disability portraits?
Great. Thank you so much for that question. Yokota Hiroshi might be known to some people listening to this from the film Sayonara CP or Goodbye CP, the 1972 documentary by Hara Kazuo, which is about Aoishiba no Kai, the Green Lawn movement, the disability activist movement, largely consisting of members who had cerebral palsy. And the main figure, the main subject of this documentary is the poet Yokota Hiroshi, who was a leader in one of the branches of Aoishiba no Kai. He's a really interesting figure. Anyone who watches that movie probably wants to know more about him. They mention repeatedly that he's a poet. He even does a poetry reading at some point in the film, though it's cut off by the police, who says that this is a public spectacle and has no place outside the station. But I was really interested in the poetry itself because he wasn't just a poet in that moment. He had been publishing poetry since 1950 and kept publishing it pretty much until his death in the early 2010s. And so we have decades of his poetry that some of it was about all sorts of topics, but right from the beginning, it was very much about his experience of being someone with cerebral palsy and what it was like to be disabled in Japan at the time. And one thing he often asked was, "Doshite motto okoranai no?" Why aren't you angrier? Asking to a lot of other people with cerebral palsy, why aren't you more furious about your situation? Not about having cerebral palsy, but about how disabled people are treated, often shut away in homes or institutions, especially back then. An enormous number of public infrastructure that was rendered inaccessible to them by a non-disabled society who didn't take their needs into account. What I find as a big takeaway from his poetics is something that Arai Yuki, the scholar of Japanese literary and disability studies, calls his kokuhatsu no shigaku, his poetics of indictment, of a real fury at an ableist society that is captured in his work. And this didn't end on the page. He wrote and published a lot of poems, but also he read them out loud in the streets as a form of protest, or he used his poetic thinking as a springboard onto activist work, the activist work that the Green Lawn movement did, which was so important during the 1970s in securing a lot of rights for disabled people in Japan. And so that's one big lesson I want readers to take from his disability poetics of the force of poetry as activist work and as a type of creative thinking that really can question the fundamentals about what we think a body is, how society should work. Aoishiba no Kai has a famous manifesto written by Yokota, which has an infamous line that says, "We deny love and justice," which sort of sounds, what does that mean? That sounds like something a supervillain would say. But what he was really saying was that non-disabled society's idea of what love and justice are themselves exclusionary of disabled people. What someone think is love as a form of caregiving might be dehumanizing to a disabled person, might rob them of their agency. So he said, "Hey, I reject what your idea definition of love is, and I substitute what we decide for ourselves." And that's something that he first articulated in his poetry and later became part of his activism. So I think he's a really fascinating and important figure who has received a little attention, but I'm hoping one thing this book can do is bring his force as a thinker to this world through this poetry. Tera Mishuji, the famous director, said, "Sho suteo machie deo," like throw out your books, go into the streets. But Yokota Hiroshi was literally writing on the streets themselves, which I think is really exciting.
Cross. What do you hope readers, particularly scholars of disability studies, not necessarily Japanese disability studies, but scholars of disability studies, including students, will take away from your book?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So one big thing that I'd love global disability studies scholars and students to take away from this book is disability studies historically has been an extremely Anglophone, Anglosphere-centered kind of discipline, very much focused on the activist and literary interventions, especially of the US, Canada, and the UK, very predominantly. And so only now there's been a lot more conversations about truly global disability studies that recognizes the histories and cultures of disability from across the world. And I think Japan is a really interesting example of this. Part of it is my own interest, the fact that so much of disability activism in Japan was done by poets. Of course, as a poetry scholar, I find really interesting. But just the fact that disability is, of course, it's a global phenomenon and anyone can become disabled at any time. So to cordon it off to just a certain handful of people in rich, developed countries in the Western Hemisphere, you're really missing the vast majority of the picture. So I hope to contribute just a little bit to show that the picture is bigger than you think it is. The other thing is for scholars of disability studies, including in Japanese disability studies, is how poetry as a tool is enormously powerful, both in its analysis and in taking what it does with language and with media seriously, but also as a teaching resource is it's extremely good for that. People's attention spans can be an issue sometimes when it comes to reading long novels or even watching long films. But part of the magic of poetry and the fact that it's usually short means that you can put a poem on a handout or up on a PowerPoint screen and spend a whole class session really taking it apart and getting to the heart of it and close reading it as a group with no prior preparation and have a really important, effective intervention just through that. So I really hope that scholars of all sorts don't think of poetry as something in its own world over there, but as something useful to them that they could use in their teaching and their own scholarship, even if they don't consider themselves poetry experts or even interested in poetry in the first place.
Well, that said, your book will be read not only the scholars of Japanese disability studies, but worldwide, any scholars and students of disability studies, and also poetry studies as well. So, if that's the reason you keep your book open access, is there any particular reasons that led you to choose this publication format?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, so this book was part of a series at University of California Press called New Interventions in Japanese Studies. The thing that most attracted me to that series was the fact that it was a funded open access series where every book published in it would be published not just in a print format, but also for free online in a variety of formats, PDF, MOBI, and EPUB. I found that especially for this book, and with all of its questions about access and who gets left out of conversations and who is not allowed to be part of certain scholarly conversations, it was extra important for this book to be as accessible as possible financially, in terms of media, in terms of screen readers and other accessibility technologies. And open access really allows people to grapple with the book in whatever format they're comfortable with. So that's something I found really important. And on that note, I really hope that the book does get translated into other languages, of course, Japanese first and foremost, to make it as accessible as possible to an even broader range of readers as well.
Wow, I see. Do you have any research directions in mind that you would like to see explored in Japanese disability studies, either by yourself or other scholars?
Thank you so much. And once again, it's such an exciting moment to be in Japanese disability studies, and something like the symposium could happen, that there's so many scholars and practitioners from all across the world who are thinking about these issues and taking them seriously. And there's been so much important and fascinating work recently in Japanese disability history, in deaf studies, in pop culture studies, and in literary studies. And all of it is great, and all of it needs to keep happening because one thing is that disability touches everything. It touches every person, it touches every art form, every type of society, every policy, every stratum of society, every gender. And so, one thing I hope moving forward is that disability studies never fossilizes into a certain thing where there's certain types of inquiry and certain types of studies that are held up against other ones, because disability itself is enormously diverse and fluid and changing. And I hope that scholarship continues to reflect that. And more concretely, part of what I hope is that it continues to take a kind of bottom-up approach to looking at materials, not just historical, but also cultural and literary. So much of disability culture is within small groups, within friendships, within families, hand-drawn circulars like the early Shinonome literary journals, which were just within one school, magazines like Normalization, which had a poem at the end of every issue, which all by different poets. There's so many of these small scale cultural interventions over the last many decades in Japanese history, and all of those, very few of those have been written about or talked about in Japanese or otherwise. So I really hope that we do justice not just to the most prominent phenomena, but the little phenomena that all together really create the mosaic that is disability in Japan.
Thank you very much, Andrew, today, right, with for sharing these great perspectives